A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 17. The doctor brought her a raincoat, a dark blue one, with a letter in the pocket. He opened the door of her cage, handed her the coat, and told her to put it on. She wondered if they were going outside, but they did not. He told her to button up and walk across the room toward the door to the bathroom and then back again. He watched, then said, "I think it fits well enough. Don't you think so?" Allie whispered, "I think it fits well enough." He said, "Good." Now would they go out? Instead, he asked her to take the coat off again. It was then the letter fell from the pocket to the floor of the cage. It was in a pink envelope. The doctor picked it up, glanced at it, crumpled it into a ball, and put it in his pocket. He took the coat and hung it on a hook on the wall across the room. Then he thought a moment, took it down again, folded it up neatly, carried it into the next room. The young keeper was not there. Next, the doctor weighed her on a scale, as he did every day now, and wrote a number in a notebook. After that, he closed her cage and left. As soon as he was gone, she went to the side of her cage and called to Victor in a whisper. He pressed his mournful brown face against the wire wall and extended his long fingers through it. Holding them gently in her hand, she fell asleep. Instantly, she was dreaming. She had received a letter. On the pink envelope, her name was written clearly, Miss Allison Adam. It was in her mother's handwriting. Then her mother did know where she was. She tore it open, her hands shaking. The envelope was empty. There was no letter. Her mother had written to her and then forgotten to put it in. She looked at the envelope again. She was sure it was her mother's writing, but there was only her name, no address. Then how had it got here? John had brought it. The thought flashed through her mind like a light. But why John? Because John was the one who would know where to find her. John could climb the animal tree and come down over the wall. But John did not know about the animal tree, yet perhaps he did. Surely Willis, when she did not come home, would have told him. As if she were praying, she wished for Willis to tell. She thought, "Oh, let Willis tell John." She looked at the empty envelope, and again she felt like crying. Her dream became happier. John was looking for her. Willis had told him after all. She saw him, as from above, walking outside the wall, his pale face looking up, looking for a way over and in. He found the tree. She saw him climb it easily, incredibly fast. He grasped the spikes on top of the wall, swung over them, hung, and dropped, landing lightly with his knees bent. The scene shifted. She heard a door open. It was John coming into the room, approaching her cage. He had found her. She could not speak. But no matter, he saw her. Then the cage door clicked and swung open, and she awoke. It was not John at all. It was the young animal keeper. He was in her cage with a strange look at his face, even stranger than before, and the prod was in his hand. She sat up and remained, sitting quietly in the corner of her cage, the side near Victor. There was nothing else to do. She heard Victor gasp, a sort of hissing sound, and felt him pull his finger away. The young man said something to her, but she could not understand the language he spoke. After Mr. Bales and Colonel Attenborough left his cabin, somewhat past mid-afternoon, Fergus turned to the books and papers that lay behind. He had, before he left the medical library, the preceding day, read to its completion the story of the Stone Head, or Steinkampf, village, both the account of the Peruvian, Diaz Rodriguez, and of the German medical expedition that followed him nearly a century later. Now he read them again, referring at times from the English translation to the original Spanish by Diaz Rodriguez and the original German by von Bülow. Mr. Bales had somehow procured all three, along with 2 bilingual dictionaries, in a matter of hours. He had had less success so far in identifying the missing paper Fergus wanted, AMB 6412-B. The oddly coded cross-reference mentioned in Dr. Schutz's papers, both he and Colonel Attenborough were sure it was not one of the Group 17's reports. Fergus hoped they were right. The story Diaz Rodriguez told grew stranger, more unbelievable as it progressed. Unbelievable? Yet the evidence of his truth surrounded him. Even the skeptical German scientists, somewhat to their own distress, were forced to corroborate at least parts of it. The old man, Diaz Rodriguez, had found in the White Stone Castle was dying. Moreover, he wanted to die. His disease, probably judging by Diaz Rodriguez's description, intestinal cancer, attacked him with spasms of unendurable pain. He underwent 2 of these as he talked, and after the second his voice sank so low as to be almost inaudible. Yet he was determined to tell the story. He had been born in the valley, as had his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. Here his sure genealogy ended, and all had lived as absolute monarchs in a nation of slaves. His own family had once been numerous, but since they did not intermarry with the slaves, had dwindled away. He was the last surviving member. The slavery was not by force, but was rather inescapable. As to how this situation had come about, he was, by necessity, at the same time explicit and vague. At least 4 generations ago, perhaps, a malady had struck the village and divided it, implacably as a wall. There had been no wall then, nor any stone castle, into 2 classes. Those who lived in the lower part of the valley had their houses along the narrow road where the stream gushed. All of those were afflicted. The people who lived higher up, where the castle now stood, were not. These last were members of 2 families, who eventually, through intermarriage, merged into one family, forming the dynasty from which the old man was descended. The malady? It was not a sickness. Its victims remained healthy, but they underwent a curious spiritual and mental alteration. They became, as the old man put it, como ovejas, like sheep. This did not happen all at once, but gradually over a period of years. The people in the higher part of the valley noticed in the beginning only that their neighbors, with whom they had been entirely co-equal, had become strangely listless. They neglected their crops, not completely at first, but more each year. Their houses and their terraces fell into disrepair. They seemed to forget to do work essential to their own survival. Yet they were not merely lazy, because when they were urged to do these things, they would do them, and they would work hard. So the relationship of slave and master grew until the end. The valley people became completely obedient, but obedient to the point of helplessness. At birth, and as very small children, they seemed normal enough. But starting at about age 3 or 4, as soon as they were old enough to understand simple commands, the ailment settled upon them until by mid-childhood they would do nothing except upon command. As you have seen, the old man told Diaz Rodriguez, they would not even eat or drink, but only waited for me to come out and give them their day's orders. When I could no longer go, they starved, even with food all around them waiting to be picked. There were legends, in a sense Fergus realized theories, as to what caused the malady. The old man's great-grandfather, a religious man, had claimed that he could remember how it began. God had struck the earth in anger, causing it to shake and a waterfall to spring from deep within the mountain. This waterfall was the source of the stream that ran through the village. Those who drank its water were afflicted. The people higher up, his own family, drank from a different stream. Realizing this and deciding that the waterfall must contain some evil influence, the great-grandfather had eventually banned drinking its water. For 10 years, all drinking water had been taken only from the higher stream. But if the waterfall had been the cause, it was too late. The damage had been done and the people did not recover. Their children, too, seemed to inherit the affliction, no matter which water they used. It was the great-grandfather who had started the work of building the massive white stone temple and carving the stone head. Both were offerings to his mountain god in hope that he would withdraw the curse he had put on the valley. Both were built with slave labor, and both in vain. To Diaz Rodriguez, this was again reminiscent of the Incas, and he wondered whether some similar event might have provided them too with the armies of slave labor they must have needed to build their cities, pyramids, stoneworks, and temples. But when he asked the old man, he found that the Incas, even the word Inca, were unknown to him. The last thing the old man said to Diaz Rodriguez before he died was a repetition of his earlier warning, not to drink the water that flowed from the waterfall. And indeed I did not, Diaz Rodriguez wrote. Though I was in need of fresh water, I took none from either stream in the valley, but made my way back, thirsty, to the Indian village 8 miles away. There the inhabitants, seeing me returning, had to a man fled and hidden. I could find no one. Fergus turned to the German expedition. They, like Diaz Rodriguez, had tried without success to hire a guide from among the Indians of Ayucalpa. Eventually, like him, they set forth without one. They were skeptical as to what they would find. To their astonishment, they found that Diaz Rodriguez had been accurate in every detail still possible to confirm a century later. The narrow pass leading in, the great stone head blocking the entry, the castle Tempic, the waterfall, even the native houses, though crumbled, were still there. The valley was verdantly green, though weeds and vines had replaced the crops, and the terraces had eroded into rounded slopes. The wooden gate leading to the castle had rotted and fallen, but the stone podium still stood just outside the wall. Nearby, they found scattered fragments of human bones. The castle itself was roofless, but still a formidable edifice. The Germans had, by their own account, taken many photographs. Fergus wondered why they had never been published. It was possible, of course, that they had. More likely, he thought, they had been overshadowed by world events of the time. For in 1936 through 37, the early rumblings of World War II were beginning to crowd most of the other news off the front pages, especially news from Germany. More important than the photographs was the fact, duly noted in Dr. Van Bulow's log, that they had brought back samples of water from both of the valley's streams. On the return to Germany, these had been turned over to the Laboratory of Applied Biological Sciences in Berlin, to Dr. Helmuth Schutz. The book, an account only of the field expedition, did not tell what tests, if any, had been made of the water samples in Berlin, nor with what results. Fergus read on, taking notes, turning eventually from the books back to the reports from Group 17. At length, he searched, and in a drawer found a long-bladed scissors, for which he was grateful to Mr. Wilcox. When the sun set, he rested, cooked 2 chops, 2 potatoes, a can of peas, and mixed himself a dry martini from a full bottle of Gilby's gin he had found on a shelf beside the refrigerator, along with the other full bottles of scotch, bourbon, vermouth, and cognac. After dinner he worked for another hour. By the time he was ready for bed, he had reached some further conclusions. It was perhaps these conclusions that led him to his second nightmare in as many nights. He dreamed of a tree by a wall. In its topmost branches, a wounded bird struggled helplessly, unable to fly. The reason for its distress was plain. At the base of the tree, 2 men were at work with a saw. In a moment it would fall. Watching all this from far off, from a road leading up a hill, stood a small boy. Fergus could not distinguish his face, but he knew the boy was Willis. As the tree leaned slowly at first, gathering speed to crash, the boy turned, ran up the hill, and disappeared. Then the bird cried out in a human voice, and was no bird at all, but a girl. As the treetops struck the stony ground, Fergus leaped forward and awoke, sitting upright in his bed in the dark. He knew instantly that the dream was an emergence to the surface of his brain of an idea that had begun struggling upward for the past 24 hours. A missing girl, a laboratory experiment that cried out, required a living human being. An approximate coincidence in time was plausible, but at a precise coincidence in place and plausibility vanished. He looked at the lighted dial of his wristwatch. It was 5:45. He got up and dressed quickly. And that is the end of chapter 17.